Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome back to another one of our Chapter 28 lectures. Our topic for this presentation is the ovarian cycle. So we are still, of course, obviously, looking at the female reproductive system. Now, the ovarian cycle lasts for about 28 days, and it's really talking about the maturation, ovulation, and the generation of that tertiary follicle. So remember, we should just see one of them being produced with each ovarian cycle. Remember, we've seen this many times, that the hypothalamus is releasing gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which talks to the adenohypophysis, triggering the release of both FSH and LH. Well, we're going to see that it's FSH in higher concentration first, and then a big spike in LH second. Now, your ovarian cycle can be divided up into two phases. So you have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And then it's half and half. So the follicular phase is the first half, so about 14 days. This is dominated by the follicle in the ovary. So we've seen that the gonadotropin releasing hormone is released, triggering the release of follicle stimulating hormone. This is going to stimulate a few of those tertiary follicles until one dominates and becomes that mature Graafian follicle. And so this is occurring about day 10 of the follicular phase. Once we get that Graafian follicle, it takes over and it's going to be releasing two major hormones, estrogens. There's actually a whole group of hormones that are in this category, as well as the hormone inhibin. Now, we have seen inhibin before in the male reproductive system. It is going to provide a negative feedback mechanism to reduce the production of FSH so that we're not going to get multiple Graafian follicles produced. Those estrogens have lots of jobs. Estradiol is the most dominant that's being produced. So, of course, we have jobs here that are related to reproduction and those that are not. So we see that estrogens are going to stimulate bone and muscle growth and secondary sex characteristics and increase sex drive and maintain reproductive glands and organs. These are all the same kinds of functions we applied to testosterone in males. But here we have another one. Obviously, males don't have the uterus. And so in females, estrogens are important in the repair and regrowth of the innermost lining of the uterus called the endometrium. Okay, so we have seen sequence of events where we have our Graafian follicle being produced about day 10, releasing estrogen and inhibin, which I've left off of this slide here. And what we see is the production of estrogen is going to cause a spike in LH. LH, remember, stands for luteinizing hormone, and it's being released by the adenohypophysis. So now this big spike in LH is going to trigger the primary oocyte to finish meiosis 1, move into meiosis 2. So now we're going to call it a secondary oocyte, but remember it's going to be frozen at metaphase 2. And we will see that spike in LH is going to trigger ovulation. So ovulation is happening about day 14 of our ovarian cycle, and this completes us for the follicular phase, because at this point we no longer have a follicle. In order to ovulate, the follicle is rupturing and the ovary is rupturing, releasing that immature ovum or secondary oocyte into the pelvic cavity. Now remember, you have those fimbriae of the uterine tube that's going to help suck that, or sweep is probably a better term, it's not a vacuum, but it's going to sweep that cell up into that uterine tube. Now that we no longer have a follicle, we are going to be moving into the luteal phase. Now, in the ovary, those cells that were the follicle become the corpus luteum. And so, of course, that's how we're getting this name for the luteal phase. And then we also need to follow what's happening with that secondary oocyte, that immature ovum that's moved into the uterine tube. Now, what we see is that the corpus luteum is going to be releasing progesterone and estrogens. But here we're going to see progesterone is going to be the really key hormone that's released here during the luteal phase. So it's being released for about 14 days. Now, its main job is to continue preparing the uterus for possible implantation. So we're going to increase blood flow to what's described as the functional layer of the uterus. We'll define that more in a later video. And also increase uterine gland secretion. So it's really helping to create a hospitable environment in the uterus so that if that secondary oocyte does get fertilized and does develop into an embryo and it moves into the uterus, is ready to implant in this nice cozy environment. So progesterone is the hormone that's really responsible for preparing the uterus and then maintaining that pregnancy. So we're seeing that not only is progesterone important in the changes in the uterus, but we also see that this increase in progesterone and estrogen levels also will help to reduce the production of gonadotropin releasing hormones. So it's basically shutting down the ovarian cycle. Looking back at that secondary oocyte, or we can call it our immature ovum, it was released at ovulation. It was swept into the uterine tube by those fimbriae. If there's a sperm there, then fertilization can occur. Then we see the completion of meiosis II, and now we can call it an ovum. And pretty soon we see the fusion of the nuclei between the sperm and the ovum. And so now we have a zygote, which is our diploid fertilized egg. And then we start to see special type of cell division called cleavage happening in order to ultimately get our embryo, which we can call a blastocyst. And then about 7 days after fertilization, we'll see that blastocyst moving into the uterus for implantation. If implantation occurs, then we're going to keep that corpus luteum pumping out that progesterone and estrogen in order to maintain that uterine lining early on in the pregnancy until the placenta is formed, and then the placenta will take over maintenance of that pregnancy. If implantation does not occur, then we see that the corpus luteum becomes called the corpus albicans, which is basically some scar tissue. And the signature here is that it stops producing progesterone and estrogen. When we see those levels decline, two major things happen. One, at the uterus, we see menses, which is the bleeding, so that functional layer will actually be sloughed off and exit the body. And then we also see the gonadotropin releasing hormone is turned back on so we can trigger a new ovarian cycle. Just to kind of help tie together what we've talked about, again, we have gonadotropin releasing hormone triggering the release of FSH. FSH from the adenohypophysis is going to trigger a tertiary follicle to become a Graafian follicle. Once we have our Graafian follicle, we're going to get the release of inhibin to turn off FSH and the release of estrogen, which is going to trigger a spike in LH. That spike in LH is going to trigger ovulation, which is going to cause that Graafian follicle to become called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is now releasing both progesterone and continuing to make estrogen. With the release of the progesterone and estrogen, we've maintained the uterine lining, but if we do not get implantation, the corpus luteum becomes called the corpus albicans, decreasing the production of those hormones, resulting in menses and an increase in gonadotropin releasing hormone, starting the cycle back again. All right, that's it for now.